Hello and welcome to Written Words. Earlier this month, the town of Gainsborough had its annual WordFest, and as part of the celebrations, I led a guided walk through the town, pausing at various places of interest to listen to some readings from literature connected with the town. So I thought it might be a good idea to put the material from the walk into a video for anyone who was unable to go and might find it of interest. I've already made a few videos about Gainsborough's literary heritage, and I'll put links to those in the description below. And some of the readings from those videos also featured in the walk as well. So there is a little overlap, but there's also quite a lot more as well. Two particular writers featured quite a lot on the walk, and they were Thomas Miller and Thomas Cooper. And if you'd like to learn more about them, take a look at my video, A Tale of Two Thomases. Thomas Miller and Thomas Cooper both grew up in Gainsborough, and they lived in adjoining houses, and they played together as children, and they both grew up to become writers, but very different writers. So naturally they will feature quite a lot on the walk, but there are also quite a lot of other writers too. Over the last year or so, as I've been exploring literature connected with Gainsborough, I have discovered some real gems of literature. So it was a very difficult task to try to keep the walk to just 1 hour, because there was so much more that I could have included as well. So if literary walks are your cup of tea, come along with me and enjoy a walk through Gainsborough, celebrating its literary heritage. Our walk begins outside the town's library, and the library itself is celebrating an anniversary this year. It's about to turn 120. So it's quite an old building itself, although nowhere near as old as the building that it faces, which is Gainsborough's medieval old hall, which we will be coming back to in a few moments. Probably the best way to start the walk off is to read a little passage from the beginning of Thomas Miller's Our Old Town. Our Old Town is a beautiful book about life in Gainsborough in the early 19th century. Interestingly, Thomas Miller never once throughout the entire book mentions the name of Gainsborough or of its river or any of the villages around. But for those who know the town, it is instantly recognisable from the descriptions. Our old town is a strange, rambling, twisting, dreamy-looking place. Portions of it are very ancient, and the principal streets are built in the form of a cross, a sure sign of great antiquity. A beautiful navigable river flows beside it and runs for miles through a rich pastoral country, then empties itself into an arm of the sea. Behind, it is hemmed in by green, breezy hills, looking as if, undated centuries ago, its first inhabitants had erected their huts at the foot of the hills for shelter, while they pastured their flocks in the valley. Beyond the town, along the riverbanks, the black bulrush still nods beside the wild water flag, while the tufted plover goes wailing over the hedgeless marshes, giving to the landscape in many places the same primitive features it wore when the river was mastless, before the blue smoke that pointed out the dwelling of man had curled above the overhanging foliage. Within, our old town is filled with gates and yards, courts and alleys, hollow-sounding archways, and windowless twitchels, lanes and passages, and staiths that go bending in and out like a maze. Without, all around it, lie little fields, which are called holts, homes, garths, glebes, carrs, crofts, closes, ings, paddocks, and other such old-fashioned names as are now only found in ancient deeds and charters. It is mentioned as a burg in the earliest Saxon records, and bore the same name then that it bears now. As there is not another market within several miles of our old town, its principal visitors are the inhabitants of the neighbouring villages, who supply the place with their rural produce, and take back in return such articles as do not abound in the hamlets. And so the exchange goes on as it has done for centuries, the living generation dealing at the same shops which their forefathers used in years that have departed. Ships of heavy tonnage ever come and go, laden with valuable cargoes, and perform the same good offices between our old town and far-off countries as transpire between it and the surrounding villages. So from the library we now walk down to the market square, which on WordFest Day was very busy with the usual market plus all kinds of extra activities celebrating the written and the spoken word. And when we arrive at the marketplace, we listen to another extract from Thomas Miller's Our Old Town, describing the market as it was in his time. It was very busy on WordFest Day, but nowhere near as loud and chaotic as it is in this description. And now the market begins in earnest. The clamour is deafening, and were you to sit in one of the sounding rooms of the old houses in the marketplace and listen to the echoes without looking at the busy scene, you might fancy that all the dead who had ever lived in our old town had come back again and were disputing possession with the living inhabitants. Bang, bang goes the brazier's gong. If he cannot get you to buy, he will do his best to break the drum of your ear. The noisy potter is ringing his earthenware together, shouting at the highest pitch of his voice, smashing something cheap every now and then to attract attention, and swearing that he will break the contents of every crate unless the people make haste to purchase. Next to him is a dealer in Sheffield hardware doing desperate deeds at the front of his covered cart, and striking the listening rustics with speechless wonder as they stare amazed at the number of articles, made only to sell, which he is offering for £1, having, as he says, 2 hard-hearted creditors to meet on the following day, who will not wait, so have driven him to make this dreadful sacrifice. A blind fiddler, perched on a stool, who neither keeps time nor tune, saws away on his rosin-dusted instrument as he bawls out his ballads, while his Bardolphian-nosed wife joins in the ditty, dispenses her songs, and takes the money, giving her customers a nod instead of a "much obliged," and continues her singing with so serious a face that you imagine hers must be a very grave business. A turkey that has escaped from its basket is gobble-gobbling and running under the legs of spectators, pursued by some dozen boys, whose shouting only causes the ballad singers to screech all the louder. Fish, in every varied tone of voice, is called from the edge of the pavement, while almost every description of fowl raises its voice and joins in the deafening clamour. A runaway pig has got under a gingerbread stall and squeals as if he were about to be murdered, as the proprietor keeps serving him with continued processes of ejection in the form of incessant pokings from the point of an old cotton umbrella. As he decamps, he overturns a cask of gingerbread nuts, and the woman rewards the boys who rush to her assistance with a quick shower of blows from the same weapon that she used in dislodging the pig. Butchers, bending beneath bulky buttocks of beef, halloo to the crowd to stand aside as they rush past to the market beam, followed by captains and mates who buy up whole bullocks as provision for the lengthy voyage. Next come men carrying heavy loads of hides to be weighed, provoking curses from the crowd, whom they gore with the sharp long horns that project at every angle from the skins, causing them to be almost as much dreaded as a drove of angry oxen. Boys, with chattering magpies, noisy jays, wailing peewits, birds' eggs, young birds unfledged, half-fledged and ready to peck, add to the uproar by their shouting, and all the sounds mingled together make up one loud, deep, deafening hum. A noisy place indeed is that marketplace in Thomas Miller's day. So let us leave the noise of the marketplace behind and walk down Silver Street, where at the bottom of the street we find today 2 pubs with very interesting names. As is often the case with British pubs, the names can reveal a lot about the history of a place. And these 2 pubs are no exception. They commemorate two characters in Gainsborough's history, Sweyn Forkbeard and Canute. And they remind us of the town's Viking heritage. One of the most important written sources we have about Anglo-Saxon times is a book known as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. It's actually a collection of lots of different writing collected together over a period of several centuries, spanning from the reign of King Alfred right up to the Norman invasion. And it gives us a lot of information about those times. And Gainsborough itself is mentioned several times in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. In the entry for the year 1013, we are told about the arrival of Sweyn Forkbeard and his son Canute. Sweyn was the king of Denmark, and upon arriving in Gainsborough, he made it his capital. So Gainsborough was the capital of England and Denmark for a whole 5 weeks. 1013. And in this same year, before the month of August, came King Sweyn with his fleet to Sandwich, and then went very soon about East Anglia into the mouth of the Humber, and so upward along the Trent, until he came to Gainsborough. And then soon Uhtred the Earl and all the Northumbrians submitted to him, and all the people in Lindsey, and afterwards the people in the 5 boroughs, and soon after all the army north of Watling Street. And hostages were delivered to him from every shire. And after he had learnt that all the people were obedient to him, then bade he that his army should be victualled and horsed, and he then afterwards went southward with all the forces, and committed the ships and hostages to his son Canute. So after that, there follows a list of all the places that Sweyn travelled to around Britain, having left Gainsborough in the care of his son Canute. However, shortly afterwards, 5 weeks later, King Sweyn died under mysterious circumstances which are not described in this particular account. And Canute takes over as king in the year 1014. 1014. In this year, King Sweyn ended his days at Candlemas on the 3rd before the nones of February. And that same year, Olwy was consecrated Bishop of London at York on St. Juliana's Mass Day, and all the fleet then chose Canute for king. However, the Anglo-Saxon king Ethelred, it seems, was not favourably disposed towards his Norse neighbours, and he arrived in Lindsey to oust Canute and his fleet. Then, after Sweyn was dead, Canute sat with his army at Gainsborough until Easter, and it was agreed between him and the people of Lindsey that they should find him horses, and that afterwards they should all go out together and plunder. Then came Ethelred thither to Lindsey with his full force, before they were ready, and then they plundered and burned and slew all the people whom they could reach. And Canute went away out with his fleet, and thus the poor people were deceived through him. And then he went southward until he came to Sandwich, and there he caused the hostages to be put on shore who had been delivered to his father, and cut off their hands and ears and noses. So the writer of this part of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle clearly was not a supporter of Canute. However, if we move on from Silver Street and cross the main road towards the riverside, we will come back to Canute, but from a very different angle. On the riverside, our walk pauses next to a beautiful new mosaic that has been installed commemorating King Canute. King Canute is perhaps most well remembered for the legend that is connected with him. Legend has it that King Canute ordered the tide to turn back. And Gainsborough people would like to think that that incident occurred in Gainsborough, or was at least inspired in Gainsborough by the River Trent. The River Trent is a tidal river, and it's not far from Gainsborough, where it flows into the River Humber and then out to sea And because of its tidal nature, twice a day the river changes direction. But also several times a year, usually around about spring and in autumn too, there is an even more exciting phenomenon called the Eiger. The Eiger is a tidal bore which comes up the river with the changing of the tide. And depending on various conditions, the amount of water in the river, the amount of rainfall we've had, the impact of dredging and farming and all sorts of other factors, it can sometimes be quite big and quite impressive. So it's quite possible that when he was at Gainsborough, Canute witnessed the Eiger coming up the river. So we've heard an extract from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describing Canute and Sweyn. But there was another chronicler called Henry of Huntingdon. Henry of Huntingdon was the son of the Bishop of Lincoln, living in the 12th century, and he was commissioned to write a history of the English. And one of the episodes in his history concerns the legend of Canute and his ordering the tide to turn back. This particular account does not take place in Gainsborough, it takes place by the sea. But here in Gainsborough, we would like to think that at least the Eiger on the River Trent did inspire the events that happened. Henry of Huntingdon also portrays Canute in a very different light to the way he was portrayed in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. In the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, he's portrayed as a tyrant who plunders and who chops off people's body parts. But in Henry of Huntingdon's account, he is a great Christian ruler, which says quite a lot about the religious and political situation in Britain at the time. AD 1035. King Canute died at Shaftesbury after a reign of 20 years and was buried at Winchester in the Old Minster. A few particulars of his grandeur must be collected, for before him there never was so great a king of England. He was lord of the whole of Denmark, England, and Norway, as also of Scotland. Besides the various wars in which he gained so much glory, his nobleness and greatness of mind were eminently displayed on 3 occasions. First, when he married his daughter to the Roman emperor with an immense dowry. Secondly, when during his journey to Rome, he reduced the oppressive tolls exacted from pilgrims on the roads through France by the redemption of 1/2 of them at his private expense. Thirdly, when at the summit of his power, he ordered a seat to be placed for him on the seashore when the tide was coming in. Thus seated, he shouted to the flowing sea, "Thou too art subject to my command, as the land on which I am seated is mine. And no one has ever resisted my commands with impunity. I command you then not to flow over my land, nor presume to wet the feet and the robe of your lord." The tide, however, continuing to rise as usual, dashed over his feet and legs without respect to his royal person. Then the king leapt backwards, saying, "Let all men know how empty and worthless is the power of kings, for there is none worthy of the name but he whom heaven, earth, and sea obey by eternal laws." From thenceforth King Canute never wore his crown of gold, but placed it for a lasting memorial on the image of our Lord affixed to a cross, to the honour of God the Almighty King, through whose mercy may the soul of Canute, the king, enjoy everlasting rest. At first in this account it seems as if Canute is trying to demonstrate his own invincible power by commanding the sea to do his bidding, but Henry is quick to tell us that Canute is actually proving the supreme authority of God. And the gesture of removing his crown and placing it on the image of the crucified Christ speaks volumes about the religious and political climate in Britain at a time when Old Norse paganism was on the decline and Christianity was rapidly becoming established as the dominant religion in the country. At this point, we turn round and turn our backs for a moment on Canute and look down the busy main road at the side of where we're standing. If you follow the road a little bit further, some 100 yards or so, it becomes Bridge Street. And on the left-hand side, on one of the buildings on Bridge Street, is a plaque commemorating Thomas Miller, the writer who lived in Gainsborough. Thomas Miller grew up in Sailors' Alley Yard, which is at the other side of the road from where the plaque is today. But the street where he lived is no longer there. It's now a very industrial part of the town. And as well as Thomas Miller, it's also the site where Thomas Cooper grew up too. So we turn now to a little extract from Thomas Cooper's autobiography. Although Thomas Miller wrote some beautiful descriptions of Gainsborough in his book Our Old Town, he doesn't mention any names and facts and figures. So we know very little factual information about Thomas Miller's childhood from his writing. Thomas Cooper, however, in his autobiography, does fill in quite a few gaps. He makes frequent mention of his childhood and of his friendship with Thomas Miller. He describes where they lived, saying, "We lived in the house in front of Sailors' Alley till January 1816, and Miller and I were more or less together daily till that time." Both of the boys were brought up in very poor households. Both of their mothers were single mothers who had to work very hard for a living. In his autobiography, Cooper reminisces, "Miller's mother was a widow and had to sew sacks for Brumby's factory. She worked early and late for bread for herself and her two boys, but would run in now and then at the back door and join my mother for a few whiffs at the pipe, and then away they would go again to work, after cheering each other to go stoutly through the battle of life." So from the main road we turn back now to face the river, and we wander a little bit closer to the river itself, where in 21st century Gainsborough we have a lovely riverside walk and some very strong flood defences, which would not have been there in Miller and Cooper's time. And as we gaze down at the water in the river, we stay with Thomas Cooper for a moment, but this time we're going to enjoy a little of his poetry. Thomas Cooper's writing was, on the whole, very serious. He was a man on a mission to make the world a better place through education and political activism. And a lot of his writing reflects that. But he also wrote quite a lot of very beautiful poetry too. And one example of this is the Baron's Yule Feast. The Baron's Yule Feast is a lengthy poem, it's a book-length poem, which describes the Yuletide festivities at Torksey Hall. Torksey is a little further up the River Trent, and the castle-like hall is still just about visible as you pass by on the main road. And these Yuletide celebrations are a little bit like the Canterbury Tales, where lots of the revellers pipe up here and there and tell their stories. And one of the main storytellers is a minstrel who has come to the feast. And he tells the story of the Baron's beautiful young daughter, who is in love with a certain dashing young gentleman. And they have arranged a midnight tryst. The girl is standing on the battlements of the hall in the middle of the night, looking out onto the river, waiting for her lover's boat to arrive. Her lover is coming up from Gainsborough in his boat to meet her secretly in the middle of the night. And when she sees him approaching, she rushes down with her lantern to greet him. So here is a short extract from the Baron's Yule Feast. "The warder sleeps on the battlement, and there is not a breeze to curl the Trent. The leaf is at rest, and the owl is mute, but list, awake 'tis the woodland lute. The nightingale warbles her omen sweet, on the hour when the lady her lover shall meet. She waves her hand from the loophole high, and watcheth with many a struggling sigh, and hearkeneth in doubt, and paleth with fear, yet tremblingly trusts her true knight is near. And there skims o'er the river or doth her heart dote, as with wing of the night-hawk, her lover's brave boat? At this point, we need to use our imaginations a little. As we look down at the river, we need to imagine how it would have looked in the 19th century. In those times, the river would have been a very busy hub of the shipping industry. There were ships and boats coming and going, unloading goods and passengers at the wharves and reloading again, ready to set off upstream to the Midlands or down towards Hull and the sea. So we will do that with the help of Thomas Cooper again, and a little extract from his memoir where he describes the shipping in Gainsborough, and he also mentions the excitement of the Aga. The shipping trade of Gainsborough was great at that time. There was not a busier scene on a small scale in England than the loading and unloading of vessels on the Trent in those years. Numerous large brigs and many sloops and keels, with a great number of ketches or flat-bottomed boats from Staffordshire, crowded the river. Sailors enlivened the streets of the little town by their merriment, and the whole living appearance of the town presented a very pleasing contrast to the dullness and desertion of trade which have characterised it since railways destroyed the trade on the river. The Aga was our great excitement on the Trent. It used to be a very stirring sight when the tide was at the full. The huge rolling waves then dashed the shipping from their moorings, if they were not well moored and managed, and boats were often crushed to pieces. The capture of porpoises on the river sometimes raised a crowd on the banks and at the wharves to see the sailors signalise their courage and activity. But the most striking incident, in my recollection, connected with the Trent, was the breaking up of the ice after the 13 weeks' frost in 1814, during which waggons loaded with coal had been drawn over the ice and a bullock roasted on it. The breaking up came in a moment and shook the town. Before we leave the river behind us and go back into the town, we'll hear from one more writer who wrote a very interesting passage about the Aga. This writer is Charles Moore, who was the vicar of Gainsborough from 1894 to 1901, and he was also a keen historian who wrote a history of Gainsborough. Not only was he a clergyman and a historian, but as we'll see from this description, he was also a very able writer. And in this passage he's talking about the phenomenon of the Aga. The name Aga comes from the Norse god of the sea, so Aga would have been the Norse equivalent to Neptune or Poseidon. But a less well-known aspect of the various legends surrounding the Aga are the Nixies. The Nixies were the daughters and handmaidens of Aga. So the big wave that comes up the river is the Aga, but the smaller waves which follow in its wake and which are particularly dangerous are the Nixies. So here is Charles Moore's explanation. Only 2 rivers, we believe, in England exhibit the curious phenomenon known to us as the Aga, although it is not uncommon in other countries. Its cause is the sudden inrush of the tide, which has been held back and pent up by some natural barrier at the mouth of the river. On the Severn and its tributary the Wye, it is now known as the Bore, and there it attains a greater force than in the Trent. The Danes, to whom it was of even deeper interest than it is to us, called it the Aga from their sea god. When the northern sailor listened to the distant sound of the waves, he seemed to hear the king of the ocean playing on his harp, and as the weird music continued, he saw the billows pile themselves mountains high and fling themselves against each other with a wild roar, so that the earth trembled and the very heavens seemed about to split in twain. The Nixies, he said, are angry. Their father rebukes them, and they cry with pain. When the incoming tide rushed tumultuously up the long reaches of the Trent, even as it does today at Morton Corner, he thought, "It is Aga the terrible. He brings with him the Nixies, his daughters and handmaidens." And his warning cry, "Where Aga?" echoed all along the bank to Gainsborough. But let a man beware of those nixies that cry to him from Morton Corner. They have a secret sorrow. There is a wild grace in their onward movement, but they are deceitful as the grave. God has not given them a soul. Only by gaining the life of the sons of men can they, like Undine, obtain reality of life. That is the reason why the white billows that follow in the wake of the Eiger are more dangerous than the first great wave himself. They are nixies, and they seek the life of man. And if he pity their distress and listen to their wailing cry, they will drag him down beneath the wave. Yes, indeed, men should be greatly ware of the nixies of the Trent. An example there of a legend that is very strongly connected with elements of the truth. The waters of the Trent are notoriously dangerous and have sadly over the centuries claimed many lives. Now our walk turns away from the river, so we turn our backs on the river, we cross the main road again and we go back into town towards the Old Hall. Gainsborough Old Hall today is a very beautiful building and it has an incredibly long history. The building as it is today would have been built in medieval times, but there was still a building there in Anglo-Saxon times and possibly beyond. Needless to say, Thomas Miller mentions the Old Hall in his Our Old Town, and he refers to it as the Old Hall, so it was considered old even in his day. However, his description of it is quite a sad one, because at the time he was writing, it had fallen into disrepair. And as we'll see, Thomas Miller does have some quite strong feelings about that. The Old Hall was a huge, dilapidated building, forming three sides of a square. One, if not both the wings, had been added within the last 250 years. Portions of the centre that faced the moat behind were considerably older. It had been let off for a long time in separate rooms for shops and dwelling places, to the great disgrace of the owner, for it was one of the finest old baronial mansions that could be found within many miles of this old-fashioned town. But excepting the walls and a few architectural ornaments, both within and without, there was but little left to proclaim its former grandeur, beyond its massiveness and the immense space of ground it covered. You peeped in and saw its great ground-floor apartments, occupied by joiners and coopers and bricklayers, depositories for lime, hair and bricks, and you turned away disgusted. So Thomas Miller was clearly unimpressed with the state of the Old Hall in his day, and he would probably be very pleased to see it as it is now restored to its former glory. If you do ever visit Gainsborough, the hall is open to visitors. It's run by English Heritage and it's well worth a visit. A rather different portrayal of the Old Hall can be found in George Eliot's Mill on the Floss. George Eliot, whose real name was Mary Ann Evans, visited Gainsborough in 1859 as part of her research for her novel The Mill on the Floss. The novel itself is set in a town called St. Ogg's, and the river which flows through it is called the Floss. However, anyone who knows Gainsborough and the Trent will recognise them in the descriptions of the Floss and St. Ogg's. George Eliot describes the Old Hall on two occasions in the novel, one from the outside and one from the inside. Let's enjoy now the passage where she describes the Old Hall from the inside. In the story, Maggie, the main character, is manning a stall at a charity bazaar. And as I read this passage, it made me think of the Christmas fairs which are held in the hall today. The atmosphere is very similar, and the Great Hall itself is very much as it is described by George Eliot here. All well-dressed St. Ogg's and its neighbourhood were there, and it would have been worthwhile to come, even from a distance, to see the fine old hall with its open roof and carved oaken rafters and great oaken folding doors, and light shed down from a height on the many-coloured show beneath. A very quaint place, with broad faded stripes painted on the walls, and here and there a show of heraldic animals of a bristly, long-snouted character, the cherished emblems of a noble family, once the seigneurs of this now civic hall. A grand arch cut in the upper wall at one end surmounted an oaken orchestra with an open room behind it, where hothouse plants and stalls for refreshments were disposed. An agreeable resort for gentlemen disposed to loiter, and yet to exchange the occasional crush down below for a more commodious point of view. In fact, the perfect fitness of this ancient building for an admirable modern purpose, that made charity truly elegant and led through vanity up to the supply of a deficit, was so striking that hardly a person entered the room without exchanging the remark more than once. Near the great arch over the orchestra was a stone oriel with painted glass, which was one of the venerable inconsistencies of the old hall, and it was close by this that Lucy had her stall for the convenience of certain large plain articles which she had taken charge of for Mrs. Ken. In this passage the hall is in a much better state of repair than it was in Thomas Miller's extract. Let us walk now around the old hall to the other side, and as we pass the south wall, which faces the library, take a little look at the brickwork on the old hall. This red brick is very characteristic of Gainsborough. Most of the buildings in the town are made from red brick, and it is this wall which I photographed to use as the cover of my book, which I will show you shortly. So around the other side of the old hall, we arrive at the parish church. Again, the parish church has been here for many centuries. It has been altered here and there along the way, but the building itself has been here a very, very long time. And naturally, it features in Thomas Miller's Our Old Town, where we get a beautiful description of the vicar, the churchwarden and the curate, along with the interior of the church itself. And the old church. There were long sloping galleries on each side, abutting on massy pillars crowned with Corinthian capitals, and which had a grand gloomy look. Green curtains could be drawn to keep out the sun. The pulpit, which stood very near the centre of the church, had cushions covered with crimson velvet edged with gold. These trappings were the gift of an old general who was buried in the churchyard, the spoil won in some battle at which he had fought. The old clerk's large folio prayer book was thumbed to bits. Half of many of the pages were worn away. But he knew the whole service by rote and had no use for the book. He had a fine voice, and there was a peculiar thrill in his Amen that made the old church ring again. It reminded you of the fall of Corporal Trim's hat. It went to the heart. His gown had once been black velvet, but time had given it a brown russety tinge, which in the seams looked like an ancient white trying to become black again, so that, like Joseph's coat, it was of many colours. When he blew his nose, it was like the bursting of an organ pipe, and the vicar's, the jolly vicar's, his port wine-tinged face showed above his white surplice like a round red sunset on the summit of a mountain of snow. It would never have done for him to have preached on abstinence. His huge double chin would have risen up in judgment against his preaching and practice. His curate was as pale and thin as he was red and stout. His very looks rebuked the great red greasy vicar, and he never seemed to sit easy in the curate's presence. The vicar was as fond of plays as he was of port, and the curate lost no opportunity of preaching at him by denouncing theatres, drinking and cards from the pulpit. Still, for all that, and with all his venial faults, there was no man more beloved in our old town than the vicar. He believed that the good things of this earth were sent for man's enjoyment, and he enjoyed them. He did not think that a seat in heaven was to be won by making ourselves here a hell upon earth, that it was a sin to go to a theatre, drink a bottle of port, or take a hand at cards with his dear old friends. So we say goodbye now to the church, walk back around the old hall, and cross the road back over to the library, where we bring our walk to an end. We have enjoyed some writing from several different authors along our walk, but I'm finishing our walk off with a poem I wrote myself about two of these writers. It's about Thomas Miller and Thomas Cooper. As we've seen and discussed on our walk, red brick is a key feature in Gainsborough's townscape. And the houses where Thomas Miller and Thomas Cooper lived would have been built from red brick. Those houses are no longer there, but somewhere are the bricks that those houses were built from. Maybe they've been taken away and recycled to build something else, or maybe they've been ground down and used as rubble for the foundations of some other building. So I found myself imagining, what would those bricks be able to tell us if they could talk? These bricks. In these bricks, these russet bricks, rough stony parchment inscribed by elements, is a brick dust archive chronicling the stories of now forgotten lives. Behind these bricks, these rustic bricks, the hand of a painter of words did labour, his precious canvas the poorest paper, his ink the finest paint. Within these bricks, these knowing bricks, a light burned a hole in the ignorance of night. Unsleeping eyes gathered words from pages and built a university in a mind. Alongside these bricks, these homely bricks, two pairs of feet trod the streets, steps in unison beat pensive rhythm, and inspiration danced. Between these bricks, these sheltering bricks, friendship's mortar held two souls firm. Memories were cemented, thoughts set in stone to withstand the fiercest flood. Before these bricks, these harbouring bricks, the river flowed as it always has done. More solid than bricks, this churning Styx, stirring up word-felt wisdom. From these bricks, these nurturing bricks, two paths divide on fate's mountainside. Two pens carve like knives on the rock face of life, with poetic flourish. Above these bricks, these old used bricks, new foundations are laid, the past hidden, not erased. The future whisks up the pollen of words long forgotten and blows them to whence they began. So thank you very much for joining me on my walk around Gainsborough, and I hope you enjoyed some of the writing that we read along the way. If you are interested in exploring more of Gainsborough's literary heritage, the readings from the walk and many others I have compiled together in this little collection, A Gainsborough Treasury. So there are extracts from works by Thomas Miller and Thomas Cooper, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Henry of Huntingdon, Charles Moore, George Eliot, and a few more as well, including Adam Stark, Thomas Mosley, William Walton, Daniel Defoe, and also a little Shakespeare conundrum too. So if that is of interest to you, more details can be found on my website at writtenwords.uk/books. And the book itself is available in a selection of formats on Amazon too. As this was most definitely a very literary video, my next one will be a little language video, and we're going to look at those little words conjunctions. We're going to look at what they are and why they are useful. So thank you very much for joining me in this video. I look forward to seeing you in the next one, and in the meantime, happy reading and happy writing.